There are moments in life when the weight feels too heavy, when the mind won't stop racing, and when the heart whispers, "What am I going to do now?" But hear this truth clearly: worry has never solved a single problem, not one. Worry only makes you rehearse pain that has not even happened yet. It steals today's strength while offering nothing in return. And yet, in the middle of that inner storm, there is a voice speaking higher than fear, louder than confusion, and stronger than anxiety. That voice says, "I am already working on it." You may not see the answer, but that does not mean the answer is not moving toward you. You may not feel change, but that does not mean change is not already in motion. What looks delayed to you is never delayed to God. There are situations in your life right now that you have been trying to fix with your own strength. Doors you tried to open, battles you tried to fight alone, nights you stayed awake trying to figure everything out. But listen, you were never designed to carry what only God can handle. The invitation today is simple. Release it. Release the fear. Release the pressure. Release the mental burden that says, "It's all up to me," because it is not all up to you. There is a divine hand already moving behind what you cannot see. And sometimes the greatest miracle is not that the situation changes instantly, but that your heart finally learns to rest while it is still changing. So instead of worrying, start trusting. Instead of panicking, start praying. Instead of imagining the worst outcome, start expecting divine intervention. Because the truth is this: what you are stressing about is already under control in a higher plan. And when you finally let go, you will realize it was never falling apart. It was always being handled. Worry has a way of presenting itself as responsibility, as if constantly thinking about a problem means you are doing something productive about it. But in reality, worry is one of the most silent forms of exhaustion a person can experience. It gives the illusion of control while slowly draining your inner strength. The more you replay situations in your mind, the heavier they begin to feel, even if nothing in your external world has changed. You start carrying outcomes that have not even happened yet, and your body responds as if they are already real. That is the hidden cost of worry. It makes you suffer in advance. When a person worries, their focus shifts from solutions to scenarios. Instead of thinking, "What can I do right now that is helpful?" the mind starts asking, "What if everything goes wrong?" And that shift changes everything. Because what if thinking has no limit? It can stretch endlessly, creating new fears faster than the mind can resolve them. One thought becomes 10 becomes 100, and suddenly the present moment is gone. You are no longer living in reality, you are living inside imagined outcomes that may never even come to pass. This month, entire cycle does not bring progress. It creates emotional fatigue. A person can lie in bed at night, physically still, but mentally running miles. The body is resting, but the mind is working overtime, trying to solve things that are not under immediate control. And over time, this creates a deep sense of helplessness. Not because the situation is impossible, but because the mind has been trained to believe that constant thinking equals control. In truth, control is not achieved through mental exhaustion. It is achieved through wise action at the right time and peace during the waiting. Worry also distorts perception. It makes small problems look larger than they are. It removes the ability to see clearly because fear acts like a filter over every thought. What could have been handled step by step starts to feel like a mountain that cannot be climbed. And once the mind accepts that distorted view, even simple decisions feel overwhelming. This is why worry is not just emotional at its deep. Apply mental and spiritual in its effect. It affects how a person interprets reality. There is also a physical cost. The body responds to chronic worry as if it is under constant threat. Muscles stay tense, sleep becomes restless, and energy levels drop. Even when nothing is actually happening in the external world, the internal system behaves as though it is in danger. That is why worry feels so heavy. It is not just in the mind, it spreads through the entire being. A person can become tired without doing anything physically demanding simply because of prolonged mental pressure. Yet, what makes worry even more deceptive is that it often feels responsible. People convince themselves that if they stop worrying, they are being careless. But responsibility is not the same as anxiety. Real responsibility involves awareness and appropriate action. Worry, on the other hand, is repetitive fear with no direction. It does not lead to solutions, it only rehearses problems. And rehearsing problem. S does not prepare you for them, it weakens you before they even arrive. There is a different way to respond to uncertainty, and it begins with recognizing that not everything depends on human effort alone. Some things require patience, timing, and trust beyond what the mind can calculate. When a person begins to step back from constant mental strain, they start to notice something important. Clarity returns when fear quiets down. Decisions become easier. Breathing feels lighter. And situations that once looked overwhelming begin to look manageable again. Letting go of worry is not about ignoring reality. It is about refusing to let fear define it. It is choosing to engage with life from a place of strength rather than exhaustion. And in that shift, something powerful happens. The mind stops being a battleground and becomes a space for clarity again. There are seasons in life when silence feels like absence. When you pray, but nothing seems to change. When you hope, but nothing looks different. When you expect movement, but everything appears still. In those moments, the human mind naturally assumes that nothing is happening. But what you can see is not the full story of what is actually taking place. Visible results are only the final layer of a process that often begins long before anything becomes noticeable. Just because change is not visible does not mean change is not happening. Life has many processes that work quietly before they become obvious. A seed does not grow above the ground the moment it is planted. In fact, most of its activity happens in darkness, hidden beneath the soil. Roots begin to form before anything is ever seen on the surface. If someone were to judge the seed too early, they might assume nothing is happening at all. But underneath, a structure is being built that will eventually support visible growth. In the same way, many situations in life are developing beneath what the eye can detect. There are times when what feels like delay is actually preparation. What feels like silence is actually alignment. What feels like inactivity is actually deep restructuring. The problem is that human patience is often tied to visible confirmation. If something cannot be seen, it is often assumed to be inactive. But not all progress is designed to be visible in real time. Some progress is foundational. It strengthens what is underneath so that what eventually appears will not collapse easily. In moments of waiting, the mind tends to fill the gap with doubt. It starts to interpret delay as denial or silence as rejection. But not every delay carries a negative meaning. Some delays are protective. Some delays are preparatory. Some delays are ensuring that when the answer arrives, it arrives in the right form, at the right time, and with the right stability. What looks like nothing happening may actually be precision at work, arranging circumstances that are too complex to understand in the moment. There is also a deeper truth about timing that is often overlooked. If everything were to happen instantly, without process, without formation, without alignment, the outcome might not be sustainable. Growth that lasts usually requires unseen stages. Just like strong buildings require deep foundations before height is added, life often requires internal preparation before external breakthrough. The unseen work is often the most important work, even though it is the least recognized. In personal experience, this is where trust becomes essential. Trust is not built in moments when everything is clear and obvious. Trust is developed in moments when clarity is missing, yet movement is still believed in. It is easy to believe when evidence is visible. It is much deeper to remain steady when evidence is not yet available. That steadiness is what keeps a person from giving up too early, from abandoning a process that is still unfolding. Many people look back at their lives and only later realize that what felt like nothing was actually everything being arranged in the background. Connections were being formed, lessons were being learned, perspectives were being reshaped. At the time, it may have felt like waiting, but in hindsight, it becomes clear that it was preparation. What seemed delayed was actually perfectly timed development. Even emotionally, unseen work is happening during these periods. Patience is being strengthened, character is being refined, Perspective is being adjusted. The inner world is being shaped in ways that external circumstances cannot reveal immediately. And often the internal transformation is more important than the external result because it determines how a person will handle what eventually arrives. It is also important to understand that not seeing results does not mean being abandoned by process or purpose. It simply means the process is still in motion. Many systems in life operate continuously without constant signals of progress. Growth, healing, rebuilding, and trauma. Ends formation often happen quietly before they become obvious. The absence of visible change is not evidence of absence of activity. When this understanding settles deeply, it begins to change how waiting is experienced. Instead of feeling like wasted time, waiting becomes active trust. Instead of frustration, there is steadiness. Instead of panic, there is patience. Because the awareness shifts from nothing is happening to something is happening beyond what I can currently see. There are moments in life when everything feels exactly the same, even though something is supposed to be changing. You expect relief, but the pressure is still there. You expect clarity, but confusion still lingers. You expect progress, but your emotions keep telling you that nothing has moved forward. In those moments, it becomes easy to trust feelings more than truth. Yet feelings are not always reliable indicators of reality. They are often shaped by stress, memory, fatigue, and expectation rather than current evidence of what is happening beneath the surface. The human mind tends to evaluate progress based on sensation. If something feels different, it is assumed to be changing. If it feels the same, it is assumed to be stuck. But internal and external transformation does not always register emotionally in real time. Many forms of change begin quietly without emotional confirmation. Just because the heart has not caught up yet does not mean movement is not occurring in the background. This is especially true during periods of waiting or uncertainty. The absence of emotional relief can create the illusion of stagnation. A person may be improving in ways that are not yet emotionally visible. Their thinking may be shifting, their perspective may be adjusting, and their inner responses may be slowly reorganizing, but because the emotional intensity has not changed, they assume nothing is happening. In reality, emotional awareness often lags behind actual development. Feelings operate like waves. They rise and fall depending on circumstances, sleep, stress levels, and external triggers. They are real, but they are not fixed measurements of truth. When someone relies entirely on how they feel to determine whether progress is happening, they risk misinterpreting their entire situation. A temporary emotional low can convince a person that everything is failing, even when gradual improvement is already underway. There is also the role of repetition in emotional perception. When a problem lasts for a long time, the mind begins to normalize it. What once felt urgent eventually becomes familiar. And strangely, familiarity can be mistaken for permanence. A person might think, I still feel the same pain, so nothing has changed. But in reality, they may already be stronger in how they are carrying it. The burden may still exist, but the internal capacity to handle it may have increased without dramatic emotional signals. Change does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it is quiet, subtle, and gradual. A person may begin to react slightly differently to the same situation without noticing it immediately. They may pause longer before reacting, think more carefully before responding, or recover slightly faster after emotional strain. These are forms of change that do not always produce strong emotional recognition, yet they are significant indicators of internal movement. Another important aspect is that emotional numbness or emotional consistency is not the same as lack of progress. There are times when the mind enters a protective state, reducing emotional fluctuations in order to conserve energy. During such periods, a person might feel as though nothing is changing because their emotional highs and lows have leveled out. But that leveling is itself a form of adjustment. The system is stabilizing, even if it does not feel like excitement or breakthrough. It is also common for people to overlook gradual improvement because they are expecting sudden transformation. When expectations are set for instant change, anything less than dramatic feels like failure. But most meaningful change in life is incremental. It builds layer by layer, decision by decision, thought by thought. Because it does not arrive in a single moment, it is often dismissed by those who are looking for instant emotional confirmation. There is a deeper layer to this misunderstanding. The mind often equates emotional intensity with importance. If something feels intense, it is assumed to be significant. If it feels neutral, it is assumed to be meaningless. But in reality, stability is often more meaningful than intensity. A quiet shift in mindset can have more long-term impact than a moment of emotional breakthrough. Yet, because it does not create strong feelings, it is often overlooked. Learning to separate emotional experience from actual progress is a crucial part of inner growth. It allows a person to remain steady even when feelings are inconsistent. It helps them avoid discouragement when emotions do not match expectations. And it builds resilience because the measure of change is no longer based solely on temporary emotional states. Over time, when reflection replaces reaction, a clearer picture begins to emerge. What once felt like stagnation is often revealed as slow but steady transformation. What once felt like nothing happening is recognized as subtle rebuilding. And what once felt unchanged is understood as a process that was never meant to be emotionally loud, but structurally important. There is a burden that many people carry silently, not because they are strong enough to hold it forever, but because they believe they have no other option. It is the burden of thinking that everything depends on them, that every problem must be solved by their own effort, every uncertainty must be figured out by their own mind, and every responsibility must rest entirely on their own shoulders. Over time, this mindset becomes heavy. No. T, because life is always overwhelming, but because no human being is designed to carry the weight of every situation alone. Life was never meant to be handled in isolation. Yet, in moments of pressure, people often withdraw inward. They stop sharing what they feel. They stop asking for help. They stop admitting that something is too heavy. And slowly they begin to believe that strength means silence. But silence does not always mean strength. Sometimes it simply means exhaustion that has not been expressed. When a person carries everything alone, even small problems begin to feel large, not because they are impossible, but because there is no shared weight. The human mind has limits. It can process, analyze, and plan, but it was never built to hold endless worry without breaking down under pressure. When a person tries to be the solution for every problem, they eventually become overwhelmed by the very responsibility they are trying to manage. This is not a sign of weakness, it is a reminder of design. Just like physical strength has limits, emotional and mental strength also has boundaries. Recognizing that limit is not failure, it is wisdom. There is also a deeper emotional effect when everything is carried alone. It creates a sense of isolation, even in the middle of relationships. A person can be surrounded by others and still feel completely alone in their struggles because they have chosen not to share what they are going through. This internal isolation makes burdens feel heavier than they actually are. When thoughts stay trapped inside the mind without release, they grow in intensity. But when burdens are shared, even partially, their weight begins to shift. Many people learn early in life to appear strong. They are taught directly or indirectly that showing struggle is the same as being weak. So they hide their pain, mask their uncertainty, and push through situations without expressing what is truly happening inside. Over time, this creates a pattern where they rely only on themselves, even when support is available. But true strength is not the absence of struggle, it is the ability to acknowledge when something is too heavy to carry alone. There is also a difference between responsibility and isolation. Responsibility means taking appropriate action where needed. Isolation means refusing support even when it is necessary. One leads to growth, the other leads to burnout. A person can be responsible without being alone. They can be capable without being disconnected. The idea that everything must be handled individually often creates unnecessary pressure that was never required in the first place. When a person begins to understand that they were not meant to carry everything alone, something begins to shift internally. The pressure to control every outcome starts to loosen. The belief that every problem must be solved immediately begins to soften. And slowly, space is created for rest, clarity, and perspective. Because not ever. Why situation requires immediate resolution, some require patience, trust, and shared strength. There is also a quiet relief that comes from acknowledging limitation. It allows a person to stop pretending they are unaffected by pressure. It gives permission to be honest about fatigue, confusion, and uncertainty. And in that honesty, something important happens. The burden begins to feel lighter. Not because the situation has changed, but because it is no longer being carried in isolation. In many cases, solutions become clearer when the weight is no longer held entirely in the mind. When pressure is released, thinking becomes sharper. When emotional tension decreases, perspective expands. What once felt like confusion often becomes more understandable when the mind is not overwhelmed by the responsibility of holding everything at once. There is also a deeper truth about support that is often overlooked. Receiving help is not dependence, it is alignment. Life is structured in a way that involves connection, guidance, and shared strength. No one is expected to navigate every challenge without assistance, reflection, or rest. When this is understood, the idea of struggle changes from something private and isolating to something that can be navigated with balance and support. Carrying everything alone may feel like control, but in reality, it often leads to exhaustion. Releasing that weight does not remove responsibility, it restores balance. It allows a person to move forward without being crushed by unnecessary pressure. And in that shift, life begins to feel less like something to survive alone and more like something that can be walked through with steadier steps and a lighter heart. Peace is often misunderstood as something that comes only when everything in life is settled, solved, and perfectly aligned. Many people believe they will finally feel calm once the problem is gone, once the uncertainty ends, or once the outcome they are hoping for finally arrives. But real peace is not something that waits for perfect conditions. If peace depended entirely on circumstances, it would disappear every time life became unpredictable, and life is almost never perfectly predictable. True peace is something deeper than situation. It is a settled state of the heart that can exist even while circumstances are still unfolding. One of the greatest struggles people face is trying to control what they cannot control, while ignoring the one thing they can actually influence: their internal response. When control becomes the focus, anxiety increases. The mind begins to constantly evaluate possibilities, calculate outcomes, and anticipate problems that may or may not happen. This constant mental activity creates tension, not clarity. But when control is released, even partially, something changes inside. The mind begins to slow down, and space is created for clarity to enter. Peace begins at the point where resistance ends. Resistance is not always visible at oft. End shows up as mental pressure, emotional frustration, and internal arguments with reality. A person may not realize they are resisting life, but the constant feeling that things should be different from how they are is itself a form of resistance. And that resistance is exhausting. When the mind stops fighting every uncertain detail and begins to accept that not everything is immediately solvable, a quiet stability begins to form. Trust plays a central role in this process. Trust does not mean ignoring reality or pretending problems do not exist. It means choosing not to let fear interpret every situation. It is the decision to believe that life is not random chaos, but a process that can unfold with meaning even when it is not immediately understood. When trust is present, the mind does not need to constantly predict every outcome. It can rest in the present moment without feeling like it must solve the entire future right now. One of the reasons peace feels so distant for many people. Plea is because their attention is constantly pulled into the future. The mind replays possibilities, imagines worst-case scenarios, and creates emotional reactions to events that have not yet occurred. This removes them from the only place where peace can actually be experienced, the present. Peace cannot be found in imagined outcomes. It can only be found in awareness of what is real right now. When a person begins to shift their focus from control to trust, they start to notice a subtle change. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel more manageable. Not because the situation has necessarily changed, but because the internal reaction has softened. The same problem feels different when the mind is no longer tightening around it. This is one of the most important discoveries in emotional growth. External conditions often feel different when internal tension is reduced. Peace also grows when expectations are released. Much of inner stress comes from how life is supposed to unfold according to personal plans. When reality does not match expectation, frustration arises. But life does not always follow planned timelines or preferred methods. When expectations become flexible, the emotional shock of unpredictability decreases. Flexibility creates space for acceptance, and acceptance creates space for calmness. Another important aspect of peace is learning to separate urgency from importance. Not everything that feels urgent actually requires immediate emotional reaction. The mind often exaggerates urgency when it feels uncertain, but when a person slows down internally, they begin to recognize that not every situation demands panic or immediate resolution. Some situations simply require time, observation, and steady response rather than emotional overload. Peace is also strengthened through perspective. When a person zooms out from their immediate stress, they often realize that what feels overwhelming in the moment is part of a larger process that is all unfolding. This broader perspective reduces emotional intensity and allows patience to replace panic. Perspective does not remove challenges, but it changes how those challenges are experienced internally. Over time, peace becomes less about controlling life and more about cooperating with it. It becomes less about forcing outcomes and more about maintaining stability while outcomes develop. And in that shift, something powerful happens. The mind stops being a constant battlefield of fear and starts becoming a place of steadiness, even when life is still uncertain. There is a moment in every person's life when holding on begins to feel heavier than letting go, yet letting go feels unfamiliar and uncertain. The mind clings to control because control creates the illusion of safety. It suggests that if you think enough, plan enough, worry enough, or predict enough, you might be able to prevent pain or secure a better outcome. But over time, this constant gripping begins to drain emotion. NAL strength. What once felt like protection slowly turns into pressure, and what once felt like preparation turns into exhaustion. Letting go is not an act of weakness. It is often one of the most difficult forms of inner strength because it requires trust in the unseen rather than reliance on immediate proof. The human mind prefers evidence it can measure, observe, and confirm. But letting go asks a person to release control even when evidence is incomplete. That is why it feels uncomfortable at first. It challenges the instinct to manage everything manually and instead invites a different way of living, one that is less about force and more about flow. Many people resist letting go because they confuse it with giving up, but the two are completely different. Giving up means abandoning responsibility in despair. Letting go means releasing unnecessary emotional burden while still doing what is needed in the present moment. A person can continue to take action, make decisions, and move forward while no longer carrying the emotional weight of trying to control every outcome. In fact, clarity often improves when emotional tension is reduced. Holding on too tightly creates internal noise. The mind becomes crowded with constant thoughts, repeated scenarios, and imagined outcomes. This mental overload makes it difficult to see situations clearly. Decisions feel heavier than they actually are because they are filtered through fear. But when a person begins to loosen their grip even slightly, something changes. The internal noise begins to quiet down. Thoughts become less chaotic. And in that quietness, clarity starts to surface naturally. Letting go also creates space for acceptance. Acceptance does not mean approval of every situation. It means recognizing reality as it is, without constant resistance to it. When resistance decreases, emotional suffering also decreases. A large portion of human stress does not come from the situation itself, but from the internal argument with what is happening. The mind keeps saying, this should not be like this, and that ongoing rejection creates tension. Letting go softens that internal conflict. There is also a physical dimension to holding on. Emotional tension often manifests in the body-tight shoulders, shallow breathing, fatigue, and restlessness. The body responds to mental stress as if it is preparing for constant action or defense. When the mind is always trying to control outcomes, the body remains in a state of alertness. But when a person releases that need for control, the body begins to relax. Breathing deepens. Muscles loosen. Energy that was previously consumed by stress becomes available again. One of the hidden benefits of letting go is that it restores mental clarity. When the mind is no longer occupied with trying to predict every possible outcome, it becomes more present. And presence allows better decision-making. Instead of reacting from fear, a person begins to respond from awareness. This shift often leads to wiser choices, not because the external situation has changed, but because the internal state has become more stable. Letting go also helps a person recognize what is actually within their control and what is not. Many times, stress comes from trying to influence things that are beyond personal reach, other people's decisions, future outcomes, or unpredictable circumstances. When the mind learns to distinguish between effort and control, energy is used more wisely. Effort is directed toward actions that are meaningful, while emotional attachment to uncontrollable outcomes begins to decrease. There is a quiet strength in surrendering the need to control everything. It allows life to unfold without constant resistance. It creates space for patience, observation, and growth. And most importantly, it reduces the internal pressure that comes from trying to hold the entire weight of the future in the present moment. Over time, letting go becomes less about a sin, decision, and more about a continuous practice. Each time the mind tries to grip tightly, there is an opportunity to soften that grip. Each moment of uncertainty becomes a chance to release unnecessary tension. And in that gradual process, life begins to feel less like a struggle to control and more like a journey that can be experienced with greater ease, clarity, and inner stability. There is a subtle but powerful shift that takes place when a person begins to live with awareness rather than reaction. Life does not necessarily become easier in an instant, but the way it is experienced begins to change. Situations that once triggered immediate stress start to feel more manageable. Problems that once created panic begin to feel more structured. This change does not come from the removal of challenges, but from the transformation of perception. Awareness allows a person to see more than just the surface of a situation. Instead of reacting to the first wave of emotion, there is a entire pause, a moment of observation. In that pause, something important happens. The mind stops rushing to conclusions. Reaction is fast, emotional, and often based on fear. Reflection is slower, steadier, and more grounded in understanding. When reflection replaces reaction, decisions begin to carry more wisdom and less emotional weight. Many difficulties in life are intensified not by the situation itself, but by immediate emotional responses to it. When something unexpected happens, the instinct is often to react quickly, to fix, resist, or escape. But those immediate reactions are not always helpful. They are often driven by pressure rather than clarity. Awareness introduces a gap between the situation and the response. That gap is where stability begins to form. With awareness, a person begins to notice patterns within themselves. They start to recognize how certain thoughts lead to anxiety, how certain expectations lead to disappointment, and how certain assumptions create unnecessary stress. This recognition is not about judgment, it is about understanding. And understanding creates freedom. When a person sees their patterns clearly, they are no longer unconsciously controlled by them. One of the most important changes that comes with awareness is the ability to step back from emotional intensity. Emotions are not removed, but they are no longer the only voice being heard. Instead of being completely immersed in fear or frustration, there is a part of the mind that observes those emotions without being overwhelmed by them. This observing presence creates balance. It allows emotions to be experienced without becoming destructive. Awareness also improves decision-making. When a person is fully reactive, decisions are often made quickly in response to discomfort. But when awareness is present, Decisions are made with more consideration. There is space to evaluate, to think, and to choose rather than simply respond. This leads to outcomes that are more stable. E